Right. I'm Professor Kim Nalder from the Political Science Department at Sacramento State and also the director for the Project for an Informed Electorate that organized this event. I wanted to invite you to come to our next two events as well if you have interest. We have another one next week on October 24th at 1:30 on campus on fake news. It's giving you a toolbox to detect and hopefully not take in fake news. And that is in the Hind Auditorium on campus at 1:30 next week on the 24th, on Wednesday. And then we have a post-election event 1 week after the election on November 13th here at 6 p.m. again, where we'll have a panel of political scientists analyzing what happened with the election and what it means for California and what it means for the country. So that is here again at 6 p.m. on a week after the election on the Tuesday the 13th. So we'd love to see you there. This event will be recorded and posted on our website. So if you have a question, if you go to the microphone so that it can pick up your question, and also share with your friends who couldn't make it tonight. Once we have it posted on the site, that would be great. So we have a fantastic panel. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Danielle Martin, who will introduce our panel.
Good evening, everyone. So today is the one-year anniversary of a group of women leaders who signed on to an op-ed that was published in the LA Times and launched the We Said Enough campaign. So today seems like an excellent time to discuss some of these issues. We have an excellent panel of women to discuss Me Too, We Said Enough, legislative and electoral outcomes for California, and also what it's like to be a woman running in 2018. So I'm going to start with just to my right. First, we have Shannon McKinley. She's the Deputy Secretary of Legislation at California Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency and the chair of the California Capitol Black Staff Association. Previous to her current appointment, she was legislative director in the California Assembly, and she's also a member of the Black Youth Leadership Project Board of Directors. And we're proud to say she's made at Sac State, graduating with her master's in government from Sac State. Next over is Samantha Corbin. She's a lobbyist and leader in the We Said Enough campaign. She leads the strategic initiatives and advocacy program at her lobbying firm, Corbin and Kaiser. She worked as a senior policy analyst in the Assembly and has 14 years experience managing advocacy and outreach programs for political, trade, and nonprofit organizations. Next, we have Laurel Rosenhall. She is a political reporter for CalMatters. She focuses on power and personalities in the state legislature, and she recently has covered the Me Too movement and sexual harassment issues in California politics. And previous to CalMatters, she was a reporter at the Sacramento Bee. And last but not least, we have Jaclyn Moreno. She's a school psychologist, a small business owner, and she's a first-time candidate for the Consumist Community Service District Board. She is running for political office for the first time, and she's a proud mother of 2 daughters, citing them as inspiration for running for office. And she also is made at Sac State. So first I want to get started with the We Said Enough movement, which was launched about a year ago today. And I want to start with Samantha. So Samantha, can you discuss the origins of the We Said Enough campaign or movement, the letter, how the group of women was organized, how they came together, and what your motivation and goals were in writing the letter?
Sure, thanks. I think even though it was a year ago today, we really have to go 2 years back prior, and in particular, a year in advance of when we were talking about writing this letter, you had the presidential elections were underway, and almost exactly a year prior to was the sort of Access Hollywood tapes with now President Donald Trump, and sort of conveying his feelings on how it was appropriate to treat women. And I think a lot of us in California, particularly women in politics, were both concurrently appalled, but also not particularly shocked that this behavior was something that folks, even in the political community, would really brush off. And then, of course, there was the 2016 election and the Women's March, which was such a huge movement. And women, frankly, from that point on, though certainly there were, incidents that predated that, were kind of working on a slow boil. And so when you got to October of last year, and the Harvey Weinstein stories started coming out, and Alyssa Milano re-upped the Me Too hashtag that Tarana Burke started so many years ago, It was just a couple weeks before our letter, and the conversation started amongst women in politics that, you know, this isn't a Hollywood issue. This isn't even a sensational issue. This is something that even us as sort of arbiters of the law are dealing with in terms of legislators and people who are supposed to be really setting the values for localities, for the state, for the nation. And so a few days before we actually composed the letter, a friend of mine was at an event, and the men there were talking about the Harvey Weinstein story and the sort of Me Too movement as it was starting or restarting. And it was like an SNL sketch. They're sort of patting each other on the backs about what great allies they are and how they support all of their women friends, and gosh, you know, this could never happen in our industry. And as they're having this circle pat of what great guys they are, there's another drunk lobbyist who happens to come over and like manhandle a mutual friend of mine in front of them. And so she extracts herself from him and says, "Did not any of you see this?" And they said, "Well, what, you know that guy?" And it was this sort of moment of, even the men that think they are allies and that are bragging about being allies, they actually don't know sexual harassment when they see it. They don't know how to intervene, and they don't know how to intervene because they don't even know what it is. And so, you know, we talked for a couple days. How do we respond to this? Do we respond to it? There was a suggestion of, let's just create a list of the 10 creepiest perverts in politics in California, and then to which I responded on an actual impromptu conference call about this. Listen, guys, your 10 isn't my 10, isn't her 10, and I think the list is probably closer to 100 or larger, and that sounds like a walking defamation lawsuit, so maybe that's not how we handle this. And we ultimately settled on the idea of writing a letter. And the first letter didn't really look like what was published. Actually, we kind of came up with our shared experience, just a small group of us, and bounced it off of a few friends. And within 24 hours, 500 women had shared it in the larger capital community. And it was everyone from women working in fundraising to acting as schedulers to actual legislators themselves who would, you know, call at all hours and sort of say, "I got your letter. I hope that's okay. I have some suggestions. I think I know where you're going. It doesn't quite reflect my experience." And so one of the reasons that I at least personally believe it resonated with so many people, not even just in the political community, was because of the intersectional input from women at various points in their career, various ages, and various backgrounds that ultimately became the letter that we published.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, and what were your motivations, or what were you hoping to accomplish with the letter?
I think of the sort of core small group of us, there were probably different motivations. I know Adama, there was an LA Times article today, a couple of us were in retrospect talking about this, and her hope had been I hope that this will have a chilling effect on bad behavior. I started working in politics in Sacramento in my very, very early 20s, and was very young and did not have the benefit of sort of a strong network of female mentors. So I had to learn a number of lessons the hard way in terms of sort of who to avoid and when and how. And so to me, it felt very cathartic, and I felt there would be particularly younger women who would want to actually talk about these issues. And as a matter of public policy, it felt very important to me that we vet this as an issue in politics, because if we're talking about things like gender equity and paid family leave and access to child care and LGBTQ rights, the people that are making the laws have to believe those laws, right? They have to have those values for those values to actually be put into place. And if we have a system where high-level staff, where men elected and women elected to office think that it's all right to harass, discriminate against, demean, abuse their staff and colleagues, this is not the value set of people who are going to move California values in the way that I believe California values should move forward. And so I think there's probably a range of motivations and a range of expectation. For that reason, we set up a website and some social media for people to respond to the extent they wanted to. My cell phone initially was the sort of contact on the website, which seemed like a good idea at the time. And then when our story went live in the LA Times, it was in almost every major national paper of record within about 48 hours, including a few international papers. And my cell phone became sort of the hotline for anyone, even including legislators out of DC, people from the BBC in London, down to, you know, sort of victims, even down to college students who had just read newspaper articles and wanted to talk. And so I think we had 20,000 hits on our website just in the first couple days. And so the response was really overwhelming, and even since then has continued as a pretty consistent stream, of folks reaching out and really looking for either personal resources or sort of systemic answers.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So Shannon, you were working in the Capitol at the time when the letter came out, and so I'm curious what the culture was like in the Capitol community before the letter, at the time of the letter, now, what were people saying about it? And then also, this is clearly an intersectional issue, so I'm wondering about if you could comment on how Black and minority women who work in the Capitol community are affected by sexual harassment and these issues differently, and how staff associations like your own are involved in combating sexual harassment in the Capitol.
So before the letter came out, one of the kind of downsides of working in the Capitol is that you really don't get to say anything. There's this culture of silence and fear, and kind of the one place that you have to report to is Rules Committee, and a lot of staff just didn't trust Rules Committee. Anytime incidents happened, they were often dismissed as part of the culture, or that's just how things are. You would hear about things, but you didn't know if something was reported, what the outcome was, or who was involved. And then also, when you go to Rules Committee, oftentimes you were reminded immediately that you're an at-will staffer. So you have an incident, you go to Rules, you're automatically reminded, hey, you don't have to be here. So that's a chilling effect on a lot of staff who either have horrible experiences that they don't report, or they report it and then they have a horrible experience. So when the letter did come out, it was great, because a lot of staff felt relieved because they knew it had been happening. And some staff were empowered to speak up about their stories, but a lot of staffers were still scared. As an organization, we had conversations about it amongst ourselves, and we tried to work with some of the other organizations, because we felt this big thing was happening and the spotlight was on the Capitol. But and I told Sam this, I had an opportunity to sign on to the letter and I didn't, because I was scared. I was scared of being retaliated against. I was scared of being labeled as a problem. And of all the women who signed it, maybe 6 or 7 were current staffers. And I know at least 2 who were called by Assembly Rules after the letter came out. So it still was kind of this culture of fear and being scared to say something, even though some women, were empowered and were able to speak up. Then they started having the subcommittee hearings, and the very first one, I remember my boss at the time was on the subcommittee, and I remember sitting there as, Sam was on a panel, you had Christine Pelosi, you had one staffer from a district office, but me and some of my other colleagues were sitting there as this hearing was going on, feeling enraged and powerless because we couldn't say anything. Here we are, staffers in this building, and we were texting Sam. It's like, hey, can you bring this up? Can you say this? Because we didn't feel comfortable speaking in our house that we worked in, but just as Californians, we felt very stifled and afraid. So, after that experience, we, as an organization, reached out to the chair of Rules to try to talk about not only our experiences with sexual harassment, but as Black women in the Capitol, we often deal with a combination of harassment. So sexual harassment is often infused with microaggressions and implicit bias and just outright racism. And so we tried to get them to, as they were looking at the Assembly and their harassment policy, to broaden the discussion to also include hostile work environment and racial discrimination, because that goes hand in hand. And so, they listened to us, and I think the ultimate policy that came out is broad enough that can encompass that without actually just specifically focusing on that. And so I think the result of the hearings, and now that they have established a new policy, I think some staff are hopeful that things are going to change, but most people are skeptical, because at the end of the day, even after all those hearings and after this whole new process is created, the members are still responsible for disciplining themselves. So I think there's hope because there was this movement, there were these hearings, but the results is similar to what exists now. And so I think there's some doubt about whether things will really change.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that you're here speaking today. So these movements, they did prompt legislation and new policies that you started to mention. And it also prompted a record number of women running. Not only that, but in addition to other political contexts. But first I want to discuss the legislation that came out of it. So Laurel, I'm hoping you'll be our expert here. I'm wondering if you can summarize the legislation that was passed that the governor signed, but also what he didn't sign, and also legislation you think that the next governor will face. And then on a more personal note, I was just wondering if you as a journalist have seen any differences covering the Capitol and politics pre-post the letter in these movements.
So, so to begin with on the legislation, I turn this on.
Your big is old, which is the truth, but you can move those microphones about 6 inches closer.
Sure. I think, can you hear me now? Yes. Great. So yes, there were more than 24 bills inspired by the Me Too movement, and they were kind of addressing two very different things. One was the problems within the Capitol that you've just heard about, which is a unique workplace unlike any other, frankly, in California. And then but the vast majority of bills were really kind of tackling broader workplace issues that would apply, to people in other kinds of workplaces. So on the first category, they created this whole new policy for dealing with sexual harassment internally. They allocated $1.5 million to create this new investigative unit within the Capitol to look into workplace complaints in a way that the backers of this plan believe it will be independent. There's reason to question that, but so there were things like that had to do with just kind of attacking the problem within the Capitol. And then more broadly throughout California, there were a lot of bills which generally the overarching theme was they would make it easier for workers to sue over harassment through various different tweaks, and that would be kind of the overarching theme. Like I said, there were more than 24, so they didn't all do that. But Jerry Brown is famous for his paddle on the left, paddle on the right. That's how you make your canoe go down the middle. That's his kind of famous saying about his approach to politics, and that was exactly the approach he took to dealing with these Me Too bills that made it to his desk. And there were a handful that didn't even make it because they died in the legislature along the way. So he vetoed a bunch and he signed a bunch, and so we kind of ended up with this mixed bag. Among those that he signed, one is going to prohibit secrecy clauses in settlements for sexual misconduct unless the complainant wants the secrecy clause. One will require employers with 5 or more employees to provide sexual harassment prevention training. Right now that's only required in workplaces with 50 or more, so that greatly expands the amount of workplaces that are going to have that. And also it expands it to be for both supervisors and staff. He signed one that will require California-based companies to add women to their boards. This is very controversial. There probably will be a lawsuit about that. And even in his own signing message, he basically said he was skeptical about the policy, but kind of embraced the goal, is more or less what he said. And then one of the most interesting that he signed changes the legal standard for sexual harassment lawsuits so that one incident is enough for it to qualify as sexual harassment. Previously, the legal standard had been that had to be, quote, severe or pervasive in order to be considered sexual harassment for a civil lawsuit. And there had actually been a woman who was a 911 dispatcher in San Mateo almost 20 years ago who was taking a 911 call, and when a coworker reached inside her shirt, fondled her breast, and he was sent to jail on a criminal charge for sexually assaulting her on the job. But when she filed a civil lawsuit for harassment, that one incident was not considered severe and pervasive. And so her case was basically thrown out of court. It was not considered sexual harassment because it was just one incident. And this kind of led to a lot of advocates in this area saying for many years that the law allows one free grope. That was their catchphrase. And so this bill that Jerry Brown signed basically says, in layman's terms, no free gropes. So one incident is enough for it to legally be considered sexual harassment and for a lawsuit. So those were the ones that some of the highlights of those that he signed. Among those he vetoed, one that was kind of shocking was there was a bill that would require the state government to track harassment complaints and the amount of taxpayer money spent on settlements in an annual public report. He vetoed that. There was a very controversial one that has to do with something called arbitration, which is when instead of disagreements between an employer and employee being settled in an open public court and then legal through the justice system, arbitration kind of keeps it private, and so it's very common that employers are more and more requiring this in their employment contracts, that any disagreements will be settled by arbitration. So there was a bill that would have really cut back the use of arbitration by making it, by prohibiting employers from requiring this arbitration clause in an employment contract. Brown vetoed that one, saying it violated federal law. And then he also violated one that would require large businesses to keep harassment records for at least 5 years. I think currently, is it 3 years, the current law? Anyway, they just basically would have extended the amount of time these records are kept, which again, of course, would make it easier for people to sue. Same thing with extending the amount of time harassment victims have to file complaints, which right now they have 1 year. From the time of the incident. There was a bill to extend it to 3 years. He vetoed that. So it was kind of a mixed bag, and he expanded the ability for harassment victims to sue with some of these, but he really limited their ability to do that with in other vetoes. And what else? Do you want to talk about what else? What bills will come back next year? Or?
Yeah. What do you think what is next year gonna look like?
Well, I think there's enough that was vetoed that I can imagine this will continue to be kind of a robust conversation next year, especially since there will be a new governor. The arbitration bill in particular was extremely contentious, and it was being backed by a bunch of labor unions, and they also had quite the celebrity lineup of women coming from all over the place to lobby for that bill, including Gretchen Carlson, the Fox News personality who had sued her employer for harassment, and Jane Fonda came up from LA to lobby for that. But one of the other women who lobbied in favor of that arbitration bill that was vetoed was Jennifer Siebel Newsom. And of course, she's the filmmaker who's married to Gavin Newsom. So if he's governor next year, that will, I imagine, be a very helpful ally for the people who are supporting that bill. So I expect a lot of those that were vetoed to come back, but that one in particular.
So next, it obviously prompted a lot of legislation and activity in the Capitol, but that in combination with other things going on in politics also prompted a record number of women to be running in 2018. And we may be feeling deja vu from 1992, the first so-called year of the woman, when a record number of women were elected to federal office, including our California Senator Dianne Feinstein. Today, it may be called a pink wave or maybe a second year of the woman, and we don't know, obviously, what the outcome is going to be. But we do know that about 1/3 of candidates for California's statewide, federal, and legislative general election races are women, and that's higher than any other election in California. And that doesn't even include our local level elections, like our panelist is running for. And 1/3 of our congressional candidates in California in our general election are women, which is also higher than the national average. And we also know that most of the Democrats who are running, a majority of them are Democratic, more so than their than male candidates, and that's reflected also in terms of national trends as well. So there's questions, though, of whether, are women going to actually vote for this record number of women who are on the ballot? And certainly women are not a unified bloc in terms of their political preferences, but we do have some reasons to think that the Me Too, We Said Enough, sexual assault issues are also going to play a role in how women vote this year. And so I'm going to take this opportunity to present a little bit of data. I promise we're not going to get too much in the weeds here. But I'm going to do also a plug for CalSpeak's opinion research that Dr. Nalder mentioned. She's the director of it, and it's run here at Sac State with the Institute for Social Research here at our downtown school. In June, we did a poll and asked about some of these issues and what people thought of the record number of women on the ballot. And when asked how important a candidate's position on, attention to sexual assault and harassment issues were in their vote choice, women, no surprise, women and Democrats were more likely to think that it was an important issue in terms of their vote choice. And in terms of what the appropriate response would be when an elected official is accused of sexual assault or harassment, women and Democrats, again, were more likely than men to support a harsher or more stringent response. We also asked if presented with two equally qualified candidates, a male and a female, who would someone prefer, just generic candidates. And the people who are more likely to prefer a female candidate were females, Democrats, those who think the candidate's position on and attention to sexual assault issues were important, those who think that women who have publicly accused Donald Trump of sexual misconduct are truthful and or trustworthy, those who feel negatively towards President Trump, and those who feel positively towards the Me Too movement. So it's clear that there's a lot of overlap in those characteristics, but it is worth noting that the importance of the Me Too issue is on the same level as other traditional so-called women's issues like healthcare and education. So clearly this is an issue that women are thinking about when they're considering who to vote for in November. And that leads us to our final panelist, Jaclyn, who is running this year. And in a story by Miranda Litzinger and Katie Orr and KQD for their The Long Run series, she said that, quote, "I couldn't stand by and do nothing while having two girls at home and a president who openly admits to violating women. I want to lead by example." So Jaclyn, I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit. What prompted you to run for office, and in particular this year compared to other years, and what your experience has been on the campaign trail?
Sure. So I am a mom. I have an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old daughter. And I was never really political before my candidate lost in the 2016 presidential election. As a survivor of sexual assault myself and with a master's degree in psychology, I know that sometimes when we experience trauma, in order to protect ourselves from the overwhelming emotions and feelings that we have from that trauma, sometimes we put it away in our brains and we don't think about it and we avoid the memories of it because it's just, we do that to protect ourselves. And when our current president was elected as literally the most powerful person in the world, that unleashed something, I think, in a lot of sexual assault survivors. And those memories came flooding back to a lot of women, including me. And you're re-traumatized, right? When someone that is supposed to be the most powerful person in the world admits to assaulting women. And so for me, I knew I wanted to do something, and I didn't know when he was first elected that I was going to run for office. But what I did know is that I wasn't going to sit and just accept the fact that this was the new reality, right? So I ended up buying tickets to the Women's March in DC, took my kids, my mom, we went, and on the way back on the plane talking to my mom about, okay, now what? Now what's next? We've done this amazing march, and, you know, what do we do now? And I don't know if you're familiar with the Indivisible Guide, but that had been circulating through Twitter and Facebook, which was basically a guide written by past Obama staffers on techniques you could use to resist the harmful and hateful agenda of the new administration. And I thought, this is exactly what I want to do, right? Like, I want to make sure that my daughters and my family know that we will probably be okay with this new president, right? Like, we are not the target of a lot of the hate that is spewed by this administration, but it's our responsibility to stand up and be a voice for those that maybe are more marginalized in society than we are. And so as a family, we talked about what we were going to do and started this indivisible group in Elk Grove. And I texted two of my friends and said, hey, if I have this meeting, would you come? And they said, yeah, sure. So I created a Facebook group, and 125 people showed up to the first meeting. And so here I am, I like to say, an accidental activist who's standing in front of 125 mostly women who are full of rage and going, please tell me what to do. We need to figure out how to, resist this horrible thing that's kind of happened to us. And so I had the chance to lead and on accident, and I had a great time. I was able to be introduced to a lot of different politicians, a lot of different people in the community that had been involved in politics for a long time. I was very new to that. And through that process, it really demystified the political process for me. I met a lot of elected officials and realized that they're just like you and I. The only special thing about them is that they stood up one day and said, I'm going to run for office. And I thought, hey, why can't I do that? I can do that, and that could be a way that I could continue with this kind of resistance movement and stand up for, not only women everywhere, but the people that this administration was affecting the most. So I decided to jump in and run. I'm running for the CSD board, which is a very small office in Elk Grove. It serves over parks, recreation, and fire services. It's a special district. It's a board of 5 men right now, and I thought that would be a great way to kind of charge into the political world. We have 20 days till the election, and I'm really tired. But I'm having a great time. My experience, though, has been very interesting. So I have had everything from statements like, you need to smile more. I really have had that, been said to me a few times. And I'm trying to smile a lot now because of it, to be honest, because it affects you, right? Like you're putting yourself out there for the whole world to see, and it's interesting some of the comments you get. I've also gotten things canvassing. One gentleman told me I should have decided I would run for political office before I got knocked up, were his words. I have been asked, I've been asked questions like how I was going to balance being a mom and running for office when I'm sitting next to the male candidate who didn't get asked that question. And then all the way to the more extreme cases. I've been called names. I have been called, the B word and the C word. I have been, the other day, someone was mocking this panel, actually, and was calling me too, several times over and over, and mocking kind of what we're doing here and what we're talking about and bringing to light. So it's been a really interesting experience. I did not expect to get attacked so much in running for a board that is literally sits over parks and recreation and fire. I mean, but I think it says something about kind of the larger movement of women stepping forward and not, my personal viewpoint on all of this was I told my family and my kids that I'm not going to allow myself to be bullied. So I am going, win or lose, I am going to stand up for not only me, but for against misogyny and for all women. So that's what I've really been, tried to do. I've been principled in that, and I can say that I'm very proud of that. But it's been a tough road. I also know that, 90% of the people that hold the purse strings, the donor community in this area, are men. And as a candidate, if you've ever run for office, you know that you spend 8 hours a week at least making donor phone calls to a community that is really entrenched with kind of the good old boys club. And so that's been kind of interesting to navigate through and to figure out how I can raise money while as a new woman in running for such a small office. So anyway, my experience, like I said, there's 20 days left, and I think we're going to pull out a victory, which is really exciting. But that's been scary for some people in the community that I live in because, I'm outspoken, and people don't like that sometimes. So it's been interesting.
Right. Thank you. And that brings us to sort of the what next or what now. Where do we go from here? So the first one I would say is vote. So the piggyback on what Jaclyn's talking about there. But for all the panelists, the last question, just thinking about the future here in California in terms of women running for office, regardless of how many win and how that might change our political community. What does the future look like for California and for legislation, for the movements we've been talking about? What are the limitations and challenges, but also what are the opportunities that you see?
I can start. Is that okay? I was just going to say that, I was just thinking about that on the way here, actually, because I ran for office and a lot of women stood up and are running for office because they were so full of rage, right? So they had that, that was that fire in them. That was like, no, we're not going to take this. We're going to stand up and we're going to win and we're going to change the political landscape, which is amazing. But I was thinking about, okay, so if I win, which would be amazing, I'm actually going to have to do the job, right? Which is exciting. But then in 4 years, when it's time to run again, that is something that, I'm not going to have, that rage is not going to be so fresh anymore, right? And so I worry that when women experience how hard it is to run for office, because it's really hard, unexpectedly so, will they then, in 4 years when it's time to run again, decide to continue and keep going? And that's a little bit scary for me because we're at such an exciting time right now that I would hate to see us take a dip backwards because women have had such poor experiences running that they don't want to do it again. Right? So I think that's just something that we have to think about. Like, how do we keep this movement going forward, and how do we keep women excited to be involved in the political process so that we can continue to grow our numbers and to continue to take our seats at the table rather than going back to where we were. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you bring up. I do think if you win and if you choose to run for re-election in 4 years, you'll have the benefit of being an incumbent, which gives you a lot more power. And so, maybe your race wouldn't be as difficult as a re-election and then as it is the first time around. But I was kind of thinking of making a similar point from a different perspective, which is that, there may be an increase in women who are elected this November, and I would be, I'm cautious about making too strong of predictions because I spent election night 2016 in Los Angeles with the assembly member who was at that time the chair of the Women's Caucus, And my plan was to write about how on the night that America elected its first woman president, this assembly member helped usher in a whole bunch of new women legislators into the Capitol. That was sort of my plan that I had gotten approved by my editors, bought my ticket to Los Angeles. And that storyline didn't pan out at all, but not only because of what happened in the presidential election, but also because there were a ton of races where voters chose the man. Then this was just for California legislature here, and there were many races where there were two Democrats, because our system in California allows same party races in the general election. And so in most races where there were two Democrats and one was a man and the other was a woman, in almost every single one of those cases, the man won. So I am cautious about making predictions. And I will just say that if there is an uptick, as the statistics indicate that there could be an uptick in the number of women who are elected this year, that doesn't mean that it becomes like an automatic trend line. And when you look at the trend, again, just focusing on the legislature, the percentage of women increased from 1996 to 2006, more or less steadily, like a little bit of bumps along the way, but generally went up in that decade, and then generally has been going down since 2006. So this year, there may be an uptick. There's definitely potential for a major uptick. I just actually got the numbers. There's right now, the California Senate has 40 members total. Right now, 11 of them are women, so just barely over a quarter. If every woman running for the California Senate right now won in November, that would bump it up to 18. So that would be almost half of the Senate would be women. I don't expect every woman who's running is going to win. In the Assembly, it's even more dramatic. Right now, so the Assembly has 80 members. 20 of them are women right now, so a quarter. If every woman running for Assembly right now wins, that'll go up to 45. So that would be more than half of the Assembly. Again, I don't, that's not going to happen. It's not like they're all going to win. But there is the potential for an enormous increase. But it doesn't mean that you make like a long-term trend just because you have 1 year of uptick.
I think this is a conversation that's not just playing out in California, it's playing out, of course, nationally. When our letter was launched on October 17th last year, since that time, over 900 pieces of legislation were introduced nationally at the state legislative level on sexual harassment specifically. To Laurel's earlier point, the vast majority of those deal with things outside of the political community rather than inside the political community. This is a longstanding problem for folks in government. They like to legislate everyone else, but quite a few, right? A very, very large conversation. But there's a lot more to do. One of the victories I'd be remiss to point out that was fairly early this year was that California, after 6 years, passed whistleblower protection for legislative staff. And while some in the Capitol adamantly argued with us that legislative staff were already covered under whistleblower protection, lo and behold, there is a current lawsuit where a woman is now trying to sue under that law, and they're claiming that because her lawsuit and firing occurred after the legislation was passed, that in fact there was no coverage prior to that. So there is a lot of work to be done just in government itself, within the Capitol halls, not just here, but across the country. And when it comes to voting, we're not talking about something that's a one-time incident or every 4-year incident, or just when it's a presidential election, or when the midterms look kind of dicey, or when we're particularly rage-filled, right? This has to be an every year issue. If we're not electing at the level of the Fire and Parks Department, we are ensuring that men who are in positions of power continue to build the experience to be in other positions of power, and we never actually diversify the portfolio. And as we're talking about sort of these women coming into office, I can tell you my personal experience over 16 years in advocacy and lobbying is that equality isn't equity. And so having more women or more people of color doesn't actually always mean they represent the interests of women and people of color. So it is an issue of quality, not just quantity. And that means that as informed voters and as people who are choosing to either run ourselves or support people at every level, we have to ask those hard questions about what their value set are, what their experience is. Have they ever been the subject of a discrimination or harassment complaint, for example? These are not questions that are asked in general sort of candidate vetting for portfolios. I'll tell you, several years ago, gosh, my daughter's 16 now, she was 7 at the time, I was looking into running for school board. I was head of the PTA. I was the senior policy analyst for the majority leader on education in the state, so at the time I considered myself fairly qualified. There were not very many men in my local political community, and one sat me down and said, well, do you really want to do this, Sam? We don't want to invest in some mom campaign. And it really diffused me at the time. And it wasn't the only reason I didn't run, but it was certainly a reason. And it was one of my sort of first entrees into how strong the misogyny is, even of people that I considered allies and frankly, coworkers and friends who trusted me to do their work for them and run important policy and trusted me with their children, but didn't trust me on the school board because I was a mom. And so when Hillary Clinton was up against Donald Trump, I took a week off and I went to Nevada. I figured my vote in California is already going to Hillary. The Democrats are taking California. And so I went to Nevada for a week. I just felt like I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do something else. So my other half and I spent the week in Nevada, walked very rural areas in the area, which ultimately ended up putting the first Latina into the U.S. Senate that year. And as we were driving back down the hill, I had just this pervasive sense of anxiety, and I called my office as I was watching people sort of post photos at the voting booth in their pantsuits, and I said, I don't want to see any pantsuit photos. And my office said, why can't we, it's election day, why can't we have pantsuit photos? And I said, because you don't celebrate until you win. And there was this frustration from my team at me for being kind of hard-nosed about it, but honestly, I really felt like I did not believe, and I still don't believe, and I think people now have come to understand the outright rage and misogyny towards women, and in particular women of color who step out of their lane. And that still exists to an extraordinarily high degree. And so how we counter that, I don't know the answer to yet. But I do know that in the 56 weeks since we've launched our letter, a week has not gone by that a reporter has not called me and asked, isn't it time for redemption for abusers now? The men are so worried. Isn't it time we can do something to make them feel better now? And, you know, there's no redemption when there's no remorse and there's no change. And so the movement has to keep going. And it's not just a matter of keeping women safe in their homes and their workplaces and their schools. It's a matter of not being harassed systemically out of running for office, or frankly, just having that inherent bias prevent people from even getting into office. And I'll punctuate with this point, for which I also have an example. There's some limited data on women running for office, getting into office, and not staying as long as they could. Maybe they don't run for a second term. Maybe they don't run for multiple terms. That's anecdotal. There's not been a significant study I'm aware of as to why, but I have an idea as to why. You know, I think it was Illinois, we just had a legislator, a black woman, step down because of threats to her family because she had the audacity to be a black woman in the state legislature. And in the first couple weeks when we heard from people, mostly women, after we launched our letter, a disproportionate number were women who had 10, 15 years prior worked in politics and changed fields. And I foolishly always thought, well, maybe everyone, maybe there's no one in their 30s and 40s because they just had babies and stuff. No. Disproportionately, the number of emails and phone calls I got were from women who said, I left the political community 10 years ago. I'm so pleased you're doing this. I wasn't strong enough to stick it out because it was so awful. Thank you. I hope this changes something. And personally, I believe that has driven women out of running for office, out of keeping office, and out of elevating up. Because if you look at the Dianne Feinsteins and the Nancy Pelosi's of the world, they can do no right by some men, no matter how much right that they do. And so we culturally have so much more work to do, and I hope and pray that we don't all end up completely fatigued. But as you see other women in this space, particularly women of color, LGBTQ community, I would just say, you know, sometimes it's not words, it's just embracing and making sure that other people know that you are there in that space, because it's going to be a long, long road, I think, for a lot of us.
Yeah, I would just, to piggyback on what they all said, and going back to my experience of working in the Capitol for 11 years, after the hearings and after they established this new process, and everybody was kind of patting themselves on the back and like, hey, well, look what we did, we fixed sexual harassment. There was an incident with a senator in the last 2 weeks of session, Joel Anderson, who was accused of threatening to slap a black female lobbyist. And, when we read about the incident, it was like, oh my God, we were outraged. We couldn't believe it. And so we expected this outcry because, Senator Mendoza was suspended and, there was all these articles, and then it was crickets. And after feeling that kind of hope of things are going to change, we were immediately reminded of how they hadn't changed much. And as an organization, we decided to write a statement in support of the lobbyist, Stephanie Roberson, because, we believed her. You don't make something like that up just because. And there had been witnesses, and he had been escorted out of the restaurant, but he denied it. He didn't do it. He said he didn't do it. So we wrote, our organization wrote a statement, and just the discussion of whose name's going to go on the statement was a discussion because our board is mostly staffers in the building who were worried. I was out of the building, so I put my name on it, but I had a serious discussion about, I'm an appointee, I'm at will, I could lose my job. But it was that important to me to do it, to stand up and to kind of call out the legislature for not saying anything and not doing anything. So, we kind of take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. But I think, all this isn't for naught. I think all the bills are demonstrate that people are thinking about it. I think the fact that people feel more empowered to speak up, I think that's definitely something that's changing. But there's still kind of this entrenched culture, like Sam was talking about, not only just amongst men, but in the legislature as well. And again, you can't necessarily count on people to promote values that they don't really have themselves. So I think we're definitely kind of moving forward, but we still have a long way to go. And I think it's important for people to be held accountable when they do kind of slip up and fall back and aren't living up to those values that they try to legislate and that they speak up about.
Thank you. So at this time, I'd like to open it up for any questions from the audience. And don't forget, we'd like you to come up to the microphone to ask your questions because we are recording. We have all these amazing women all in the same place. There's no questions.
So where are the men? You talked about, Samantha, about how, right? Even look around in this room. Samantha, you talked about having people who thought of themselves, men who thought of themselves as allies who didn't see it. How do we bring them in to see it? It's like if you had a leaky pipe in your house and the way you dealt with it is just moving out of those rooms and taking medicine for your mold allergy instead of fixing the pipe. How do we fix the pipe? How do we get the men to actually buy in or do something or change? It's not, why is it on us to fix in the first place?
Well, I think this is a question rightfully that many of my friends and women in my life who are friends of color have been asking for years about racism, right? It's not the black women who need to save black women and all people of color from racism. The people who have the privilege have to step in and also exert themselves to sort of shine a light on that, not only because it's traumatizing and exhausting for the people who are being oppressed to try to unoppress themselves, but ultimately because they're not the ones in the position of power to begin with. And I, was to even punctuate on to Shannon's point, when this incident happened, the lobbyist who, had not signed her letter was someone I talked to, and she had very similar concerns about, I'm a black woman, I'll be an additional target. This had come out that this had happened to her. I get probably 5 or 6 press calls a week on an uneventful week on this subject. And no one was talking about that issue. And so my response was specifically to bring up the issue of women of color in the Capitol and what are we doing in the nexus of racism and misogyny, because reporters were asking that question and that conversation wasn't happening. And that's the ideal place we would want men to be, right? It is a point of understanding not only their own privilege, but how they can leverage that to drive change. And it's not enough to say, I'm not a creep, or I don't think I'm a creep, or I'm absolved of my creepiness. It's really not the point, because it's not just about creepiness, frankly. It's about privilege and understanding that you are three tiers up the ladder and someone else doesn't even have a ladder. And, you know, at every level, it's the job opportunities women don't get because they weren't on the golf course or at the bar after work, because that's where they're either going to get called a slut or harassed for being in the first place. So getting men to point of understanding is important. But then also, number two, and this is the hardest thing, again, I think it goes back to the conversation, I know at least as a Democrat, I'm having sort of, hey, white women, we disproportionately voted for Trump. So if you have to have a really uncomfortable conversation with your mother at Thanksgiving, have the frickin' conversation. And that's hard, right? I'm still like looking for resources to go home to my pro-Trump trained family and have those conversations in advance of the holidays. And so how do we resource men in that very same way so that they're standing up to other men? They're pushing back on their own boys club, because they also risk then isolation and removal from their positions of privilege for standing up. And great, so do we, but getting men to a place where they understand how to leverage that privilege in a way that can be impactful and isn't just reputational harm to them on top of everything else. I don't know that there's a clear pathway, and that's not to say there shouldn't be, but I do think there's a lot of reticence for men to contradict other men, for men to push back on other men in a way that's not overtly aggressive or inappropriate. But we do need them there, and we do need the intersectionality across the spectrum, because the issue of misogyny, the issue of discrimination, it can't just be perceived as a women's issue, because men are certainly abused. People in the LGBTQ community, men and women, are also abused in very, very similar ways. And people of color are abused in very similar ways. And it's very difficult to parse, like, well, is this discrimination or harassment or abuse, or are you a racist or a misogynist? You know, at the end of the day, abuse is abuse. And so how do we build in tools as a sort of national community to not only address those publicly, to appropriately address them in the press that's not in a way that's re-triggering, and then to equip people with tools to have productive discourse. And we're not there yet. And we can get there, but we're going to need a lot of men coming to the table, honestly, to have those conversations about what makes them feel uncomfortable and what tools, frankly, they need to engage more.
I just wanted to say that that's one of the things that's been the biggest surprise for me in running for office. In fact, I had to have very difficult conversations over this last week with other men that are in the political realm that are running for office in my community, about my expectation towards them to stand up for me when I'm being talked about or when I'm being, degraded behind my back. And these are men that are self-proclaimed progressive men in the community that will be the first to stand up and say, I am an ally. Well, if you can't be an ally behind closed doors when a woman is being degraded, then how does that make you an ally? And so those conversations have been very difficult to have, but in my opinion are so necessary, because they need to understand the perspective of a woman running for office and what my expectation is for them as an ally and how they're failing at this particular moment. Because if we don't come forward and say those things and have those hard conversations, then it's going to be business as usual. And more women are going to come in and run for office and have a really hard time and then never do it again. And so in order to build up men and give them the opportunity to do the right thing, we need to tell them what we expect from them. And so that's been my, that's what I've been trying to do, but it doesn't solve the whole problem, right? Because you still have power, these men that are in power and want power, competing with this culture where being an ally towards women or women of color or people in the LGBT community competes with that power. And until we I believe, get more women elected into office and talk about our expectations about what it means to be someone in power and shift that culture, we're going to have to speak up and continue to have these difficult conversations. So that's just been my experience. And like I said, win or lose this election, I will not stop standing up for what the principles of what got me into this election in the first place. So, and I think that's important to remember as we all kind of, move forward in this process.
I'm right here. I'm answering your question. I'm right here. Yeah, I'm 74, and for the last 8 years, I have run seminars at Sac State. Actually, it's in Renaissance Society. Perhaps you've heard of Renaissance Society. And I run 16 seminars now. The one I'm running right now is called Women. I decided to do this last April. So the course is called Women Infamous, Unfamous, and Famous. Normally in my seminars, I draw between 100 and 140 students every Friday afternoon to come and listen for a couple hours. This time, the number has dropped down to about 75, including about 5 guys. So the reason it appears, the reason it's dropped off from 120, 140 is because there's no guys showing up. That's very frustrating. But it maybe goes to the heart of what you've been talking about. They're just not showing up. And it's not like I'm talking about all the broad-burning topics. I'm talking about historical kinds of things. And these guys are just not signing up for my class. Very frustrating. Now, by contrast, I also get together a couple times a week with a group of retired teachers. And they are all with you, hand in glove. They all are fine with what's happening and wish you the best. But it's very frustrating to be in this Renaissance society that all the men have dropped out of my classes. So that's where we are, not available.
I think just to add to that point, I really appreciate you sharing that. One of the things that we've been talking about from the context of We Said Enough and the nonprofit that we founded is building out systems. And right now there's a problem of never-ending reputational damage to men and women, or the accuser and the accused in instances of harassment and assault. And I think the Kavanaugh case is a great example, right? You're talking about something that happened 37 years ago and it was vetted on a national stage and there still was no due process, and both of them will have really harm done to themselves and their families into the forever. I mean, indefinitely, it certainly seems like. And there are some basic things that we're lacking. You lack sort of a confidential place for people to come forward and have a conversation. There's a lot of anonymity with the internet to sort of, tell your story right now, but that kind of Twitter justice is not, it's not sustaining, right? And it's not sustainable because it doesn't actually result in an investigation or a change in behavior. It's just sort of like a shot across the bow. And so you need confidential places where people can go, have conversations, be resourced. You need schools and employers and communities that are set up to actually process and adjudicate for those type of complaints, because not everything in the sort of harassment discrimination spectrum it's not a binary conversation. You're not a sinner or a saint. You're not a rapist or an angel. There's a lot of boundary crossings that are, particularly if you talk about, God, I was in a sorority in college. You throw in alcohol onto a lot of things and things get very confusing. And so how do you ameliorate for those things and process them in a way where it's proactive, it's allows room for resolution, and then ultimately healing and learning, so that you have people who are engaging in harassing and abusive behavior that learn, number one, they actually hear that that's an expectation that's not appropriate, and there's consequences for which they change their behavior. And then ultimately, of the victims I've spoken to across the country and out of the country, most people just want the behavior to change. It's very rare that women who've been abused in particular want to see someone fired or locked up in jail, except for some pretty egregious circumstances. They want that person to just stop doing that. They don't want to be silent and know that 10 years later they did it to 20 other women. And so having processes in place is essential. And until we get to that place with universities in particular, K through 12, where a lot of these behaviors start and are sort of codified into people for the rest of their lives, we have to get in front of it with setting clear expectations, because trying to set the expectation with someone who is 35 or 45 or 55 and has never been told that that's the expectation, it's very alarming. It feels like an assault, and it's because we're coming at it 2, 3, 4, 5 decades too late. So we do have a lot of work to do much earlier, and then frankly across systems, at least in my experience and opinion, to systematize how we address these so that everything is not played out in the court of public opinion and sort of a live or die argument.
So, speaking of K through 12, I am currently a K through 12 student, and sexual assault and rape are constant jokes at our school, and I never know what to say, and if I do say anything, I'm labeled off as a strong feminist. So either I say something and I'm just nothing to it, or I don't say anything and the jokes just continue. So I never know what to do about that.
Also, what do we do to prevent people from saying these type of things about making these jokes about rape and all that type of stuff?
Those are great questions. What grades are you guys in?
We're both in 8th. I just turned 13.
You're both in 8th. So my daughter's a junior at St. Francis. She's 16. And we have these conversations a lot. I think it's not a private school or a public school issue. It's even at an all-girls school, these conversations still happen. So it's not that they're abnormal, but I think similarly to the horror some of us are feeling looking at national politics, we need to denormalize some of these things and speak out to them. And so, we've been involved, I know some of the other Capital Community has with some of the local high schools in particular in response to how the schools have been addressing complaints. I'm personally, just for work, putting on my work hat, working with the entities that deal with lawsuits for schools right now. So the average claim right now is about $9 million an incident when you have a very severe sexual assault incident on campus, which is actually the failure to deal with it is like taking money away from you guys having sports programs and other things. It's pretty egregious. And so number one, I would just say there's absolutely nothing wrong with your vantage point and you standing out. You are doing the right thing, but know that, never assume malfeasance for where ignorance can be blamed. So never assume someone's just trying to be a horrible person when they just might be ignorant, especially teenage boys, frankly. And I will tell you, even at the highest echelon of politics and power, peer pressure is still a real thing. That doesn't ever go away. I tell my daughter that all of the time. And so you have to kind of get to a point where you feel like it's okay if I get criticized, and figure out who's your team and what's the culture you want to set. Because, to the point that was made about even people in the election community, what's the expectation you want to set in your school? What's appropriate? What's not? I guarantee you there are teachers at your school who will have this conversation with you and help you have it. There are McClatchy High School just this last year. It didn't get a lot of press, but they did a full day walkout with about half the students because of the way that the school responded to a sexual assault complaint on campus. And the teachers walked with them. And so find your teachers that you trust and talk to them about how you build a culture. Talk to your principal. The principal's job is to make sure that you guys get in and through school in a safe environment where you can learn. And if you have to constantly mitigate for abusive behavior from students, from teachers, from parents, I don't care who it is, that's not creating that culture for you. And this is the climate for you to have those conversations with adults, and it is their job to help put systems in place to help you navigate them. But what we find is a lot of times the adults are ignorant too, right? They don't understand what's happening in the classrooms until it gets to the level that it's so bad that they have to deal with it. So find your adults, get your team, and talk to the adults and start setting expectations, because there are resources for that, and you absolutely can and should ask for them.
So I'm in my school's leadership program, and I would really like to find a way to do something about the ignorance in our school, and I have no clue because I don't want to overstep bounds, but I also don't want to fail to truly show that this is a big issue here. So what can I do?
I'm in the awareness committee in leadership at our school, and I actually got in it with my two of my friends, and we actually got in it to try to raise awareness about this type of stuff. And I don't really know if we even can raise awareness at our school about this type of stuff. And I don't even know, we don't even know where to start with this type of stuff.
Yeah, I actually wanted to do something for mental illness, but I had to go all the way to the school board because it wasn't in the school's hands. So it was a lot more than I could really handle to do. And not a lot of teachers, like, they were like, yeah, you go do that. We'll stay safe with our jobs. So.
First of all, I just have to say that you two are pretty impressive. And I have an 11-year-old daughter, and I hope that she's just as big of an activist at your age, that you are. So thank you for stepping into the fray, because it's hard, right? It's so hard, especially when you know you're going to get criticized for it. Mm-hmm. It's so, so tough. So I just wanted to say thank you. And the second thing I wanted to say is that one thing that I've learned, I'm old, a lot older than you are, and one of the things that I've learned through this campaign is the most powerful thing that I have is my voice. That's hands down the most powerful thing. No one can take that away from me, right? So I think you just keep using your voices. You find the adults that are going to be there for you, and you talk to them, and you don't be afraid to be labeled a feminist. There's nothing wrong with that. Make it cool. That is cool, right? Mm-hmm. And I would say just keep using your voice. That's what I just always tell myself and my daughters. Just don't let people take that power from you. Mm-hmm. You are so powerful. Step into it, embrace it, and use your voice, Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would say, gosh, there's even been some other recent local high schools that have had student walkouts for other issues, racial discrimination, and sort of just, frankly, cultural incompetence of their teachers. And sometimes it's also really helpful to kind of write down the list of what you want to accomplish, right? It's one thing to sort of be rage-filled or frustrated and want to make change but not know what you're changing. And it's even harder when you sort of like, I was in like the feminist club in high school, or you have the awareness club, but the people who are in those clubs are already kind of woke, right?
Yeah.
They're not like, the people that are horrible are not like,
we're trying to change.
Right. Yeah. I hate feminists, I'm going to join the awareness club. It's not happening.
Not how it works.
So you have to get outside of that, which means you have to have a consistent message that you know what people are going to push back on. I know for us, when we first started asking for reforms, we had a list of 5 things. Number 1, confidential reporting, due process, etc. And so every time people would come back and they'd try to gaslight us, which means make you feel like you're crazy by suggesting an alternative reality, basically. They'd say, well, we already fixed this. And we'd go look at our list and we're like, no, you didn't fix any of these things yet. And so knowing what your action items are and getting people engaged around those is totally important. You have a club on campus. Clubs on campus can host events. Okay. You can host events across the street at the coffee shop or at someone's house. You don't have to have the school board's blessing to do all of those things. And frankly, if you need your school board's blessing to do something you want, do a letter writing campaign. Engage reporters. Reporters love to get engaged on these kind of issues. You know who hates when students are worried about getting assaulted and harassed and discriminated against, and they're talking about it in the press? The school boards that represent those schools. So your voice is really powerful. Make your list, find your farm team, and just start asking for what you know needs to change.
Okay. And also going directly to your school board. Yes. Just because you're 18 doesn't mean you can't speak in front of them. And you make your list, you go with your list, you take some of your folks from your club with you, and you let them know, these are problems at our schools. We need these fixed. We've talked to our principal, they haven't done anything. And you keep going because, there are parents there, there are other people, advocates there. You have a right to do that and a right to speak up. And, those meetings are recorded. Maybe you get a reporter, maybe you get, people kind of bringing attention to this issue, and then you may hear about the same experience going on at this school over here in this other neighborhood. So, like she said, don't be afraid to use your voice, but also don't be afraid to go directly to the school board and let them know that this is a problem and they need to do something about it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I also just wanted to add one more thing, because I really liked what you said about the letter writing campaign. Think about, you are 2 people, right? Think about how powerful it would be if you had 50 or 100 people write letters about the same types of harassment that you experience at school, and you took those letters to the school board and you said, look, here, it's not only me, I'm not crazy, right? Here's the issue that's happening. So think about how you can use your influence and your voice to pull people along with you, because I guarantee if you're feeling this way, a lot of other people are too.
Can I say something? As a school teacher and a professor at Sac State of Education, this is an opportunity to do some research, because if you talk to some people and you start collecting data, that's going to help you make your case. And if it's like how many rape jokes have been made today and each day, and that's 50 this week, and that's times 180 days, that's like, I don't know, because I don't do that. I mean, it's an opportunity to use all of the skills that you've developed as a student to lay out a case for what it is that you want. Do research and find out how many people are telling what kind of jokes, and that's your thing, and then lay it out there so people, they can't deny what you and your colleagues are saying. So I think you're onto something.
Yeah.
Me too.
Hi. I think, can you hear me? No? Do I have
Go a
to
little
do
closer.
this? Okay, now, what was I going to say? Oh, I came here tonight. I want to thank you all for being here. I did not expect all these lovely women here. I came to hear Lynn Farley, I thought. But it's all part of the Me Too and the series that the university has brought. So I have been, I'm 60 years old, and I grew up believing that women could do anything, and I grew up in a very liberal community. But as time has gone by, I realized that the roles have not changed dramatically. There is not a solid female leadership. I don't really feel that way. I don't at all. You speak in higher levels of government with Pelosi and what's her name, Feinstein? Sorry. And with this recent Me Too, and then I marched in Sacramento, was it 2 years ago? Did we do I guess when Washington marched? Sorry, I don't have the statistics here. And recently, with what's gone on with the hearings with, what's his name? God, I am 60. Kavanaugh. I have felt among men closest to me a feeling of backlash, a feeling of fear, a feeling of this is not cool, this is not comfortable. And the best words I've ever given to those men that I love dearly, many of them, is that, no, this isn't comfortable for me either. It's like guilty before proven innocent. This is going on. It is a problem. It's being addressed. And it doesn't feel good to us either. But it has to happen. Wouldn't you agree? Would you want this to happen to me when I was at work? Hell no, I'd kill him. But that poor judge, So it's the interpersonal dynamic between men and women is, it's delicate. And I want men to know that they can come forward without having to admit guilt. And I don't know how to bridge the gap with offenders. And of course, there's a continuum of offenders. And in my life, I have always stood up to men that have come at me, so to speak. And I want that for all women I know. I want them not to have to put up with it. I don't want women to not take that job because somebody told them this is how you get it. It's gradual, it's subtle, and it's difficult and uncomfortable, and there's a backlash. And that's just part of the process, I'm sorry to say. So hang tough, and I have to go home and go to bed. Thank you so much.
I would just add a point to that I think it's a really interesting perspective, the interpersonal dynamics. When we, after we launched our letter, there was a year of press where there were women who came forward and specifically named their perpetrators.
I think those of us that sort of got propelled into doing regular press coverage and speaking on behalf of a lot of other women, we recognized that we really didn't have the luxury to be a victim, because it could be perceived as everything that we were doing was some sort of personal vendetta or something that would detract from really the larger conversation, that we didn't want someone to be scapegoated. We wanted just systemic change in this conversation to continue. And as soon as you have a name attached to something and an incident where people can sort of gauge the her and the him, or the him and the him, or the whoever it is, and have an opinion about those people, it shifts the dynamic about systemic change and how do you actually deal with these type of things. And I had long felt this, but I've not come forward and said the name of any sort of perpetrators I've had in my life. However, of the few dozen women that did come forward and specifically go out in the press, New York Times, LA Times, and actually name men, one of them named my rapist. And what was so interesting to me to watch was the reaction that people had to her coming out and naming a name as someone who assaulted her, and immediately engaging in this, well, you know how she is, and gosh, how he is, and this conjecture of kind of the interpersonal. And then I thought, well, I'm never saying anything again. And it goes back to the previous conversation of, we have to have systems in place that can address infractions at every level in a way that's safe, because otherwise it's not safe for anyone to come forward, and there's never any hope of any kind of resolution or any kind of healing. And the reason I think the Me Too movement has been so effective is because it's not predicated necessarily on naming a person. It's on the idea that women have experienced cumulative trauma. And on that point, people can agree. I think that's actually why with Dr. Ford in the Kavanaugh case, it was so easy for people to say, I believe her, I just don't know if I believe he assaulted her, but I totally believe someone assaulted her, as if you forget who your own assaulter is. But it's that layer of interpersonal that people really do struggle with. And I think that's why I would just continue to encourage at a policy level, school level, employer level, having clear systems eliminates a lot of the personality contests that are associated with these type of conversations.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And thank you especially to our panelists for a great discussion tonight. Thank you.